Am I clearly visible and audible?
Yep.
Okay. How do I want POIs? In
Verbal.
chat, if I haven't taken any by minute 5, feel free to open your mic.
Thank you.
Cool. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. We're going to talk about how the simulation uniquely creates a huge extent of empathy and how that manifests into positive change for the most underprivileged people in society. First, a bit of framing and setup for the debate. Poor people are far more giving than rich people, despite having far less to give. Those who have always felt empowered struggle to understand why someone would be disempowered and need the support of others. Those who have always had everything they wanted given to them don't understand why they should be obligated to give anything to anyone else. We think that by giving everyone the experience of poverty, we make everyone have the same drive to improve poverty, the same empathy for those in poverty, as today only those who have risen out of poverty been able to. Today, we talk about the value of getting people out of poverty so that they become role models and they become people who go back and give back to their societies. We think a far more effective way of doing that is making it so that everyone has this empathy. Let's set a clear mech. Within the machine, it feels real as a dream can feel. You don't tell that time is passing more quickly than it should. It recreates the experience of a real month passing. It recreates the experience of absolute poverty in my own country. So let's say the bottom half of the bottom decile, so the bottom 5% of the society within my country. I still feel like I'm myself. It doesn't simulate an alternate life. I still simulate someone who is Israeli, who is Jewish, who is living in Israel, who is a Yal. I'm not just simulating the life of a poor person. I'm simulating a Yal living in the conditions of a poor person as if a realistic dream would be doing it for me. Note, if opposition want to mandate use of the machine but not every year, they're not meaningfully opposing the motion. They have to stand for why on their side, no one is mandated to use this machine even if it does exist. Let's get into my first argument, why this is effective at creating empathy for poverty. I want to frame what people are going to be exposed to when they're exposed to absolute poverty. First, the lack of nutrition or food security, not knowing what you're going to eat, when, or whether it'll be good for you. Second, the feeling of impending or present homelessness, having no house security, being deep in rent to your landlord, or living in a house that is dangerous or unsafe for you. Third, the feeling of crushing of debt and crushing debt payments. Fourth, the feeling of backbreaking labor for countless hours, minimal pay with shitty treatment from your bosses, or even the experience of begging for change on the street. Fifthly, feeling the draw of escapes like smoking and gambling and drugs, or even experiencing being addicted to them, because they're the only way out of the suffering of daily poor life. Sixthly, feeling that that as a parent, that you're a parent to kids whose needs you can't meet, who you can't feed or you can't house. Finally, the fear of being in the bad side of town, of being outside after midnight, of taking the train when it's no longer safe, or being in a or living in a house with no safe windows. Clarification. Go ahead.
Just want to make sure, is this a playable simulation in which you make decisions and are doing things actively, or is this a dream in which you're passive and you just experience
I
but
I
don't make any
think
decisions?
I think that most simulation video games are actually just a pre-written novel. I think you have as much control as you do in a dream. You have the experience of control, but I don't know if it's real control. I think that you're definitely not actually able to change your conditions of poverty, and absolute poverty is simulated from the beginning until the end. That's what's most important to me. Let's mechanize why we get empathy. First, we think people have a unique understanding of the pain, of just how hurtful it is in how physically and mentally to be living through poverty day in, day out, just how grinding it is. Secondly, the hardship, the exhaustion, the constant effort and attempts to improve your conditions at great expense to yourself. Thirdly, the helplessness, the inability to ever change your own conditions, the deck being so stacked against you that your condition feels so absolute that you can never get out of them. No matter what you do in the simulation, you are never able to improve your conditions of absolute poverty. You don't perceive it as being your own fault within the simulation. You don't perceive yourself as having done anything to deserve this poverty other than having been born into it. Fourthly, you understand the reliance on support, on how much a person on the street giving you a bit of money, how that can get you a place in a hostel for the night. How a soup kitchen can get a meal in your stomach. How a kind person willing to give you a job, even though you're not quite qualified enough, just so that you have some work and are able to feed your kids, how great that kindness is. How amazing it is when there's welfare checks, or when the education system that you send your kids to is actually a functioning education system that you're able to trust. Why is this so very present in people's lives? First, it's an incredibly meaningful experience. It was very strong, very real, like some amazing show that they watched. Secondly, it was a personal experience. Unlike the most meaningful TV shows or movies I watched, I remember this as though it happened to me. I keep pondering about what I would do if this happened to me. Same as how some of us ponder what we would do if we moved back in time, the 11th century. Third, there are constant reminders of it, because whenever you see poor people struggling around you, you think of what it's like to be in their experience. And fourthly, it's yearly. You can't forget it. It keeps adapting to where you are in life. As Rumen changes, the Rumen that is simulated by the machine changes. And as the society you grew up changes, and the conditions of being poor in them changes, so do they change. But you're always reminded of what it's like, and it's always actual and relevant to your life and the life around you. POIOO.
Do you also support taking people's kidneys and giving it to people who have failing kidneys, even if the original people are healthy?
I believe that if people didn't lose their original kidneys, then yes. I believe that if I could give people the experience of losing their kidneys and in exchange give a kidney to other people, I would absolutely support this. Okay, let's talk about how this manifests into positive change. First, we have legislative pressure. The way people vote in elections and the number of them who vote in favor of welfare programs, in favor of funding the poor, in favor of taxation systems that benefit the poor more at the expense of the rich are far greater. The ability to blame welfare queens for leeching off the system and claiming that it's their own damn fault and they could just lift themselves out of poverty by their own bootstraps, that narrative falls out. Secondly, we get people more active and more giving. So we get more donating to charities, more people starting up charities, more legal protection of charities. We get better bosses and better consumers. When I know what it's like to be to be working for a 24-hour shift at the gas station, I'm going to be far nicer to the employee at that gas station. When I know what it's like to be a cleaning lady, I'm going to be a lot nicer to my own cleaning lady. And finally, we have better capacity. We think that having awareness of what it's actually like to be poor, what actual issues the poor have, and the fact that all politicians and all civil service members have this awareness means that they make policy that's more relevant to the actual issues facing the poor and in the order of precedence and priorities that the poor people would give it. We show you that we create significant empathy, which translates into significant positive change for the most underprivileged people in society. For all of these reasons, go with opening government.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to a leader of OP to open their case in today's debate. Here.
Clearly audible and whatnot. Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When governments say to us that we're not allowed to say, oh, we'll do it once and not every year, and we're not opening the motion, this is bullshit. The government needs to not only prove that this is important, they also need to prove that this needs to be done every single year for this to be efficient, not once, every single year. It's going to be a huge problem because bodily autonomy is the highest right an individual can have. Couple of points in my speech. 1, why this is not going to be efficient. 2, why this is likely to have a counter effect. 3, where there are alternatives to fix poverty. And 4, why bodily autonomy is the highest right a person can possibly have. Firstly, on the idea of why this is not going to be efficient. Well, look, people are doing this only for a month. That means that after a month, no actual tangible consequences appear to you. Note also that no severe experiences can be had. Meaning, you can't feel what it feels to be like of dying of starvation. You can feel what it feels to be like kind of hungry. You can't feel extreme emotional stress to that extent. You can't feel what it feels to be truly and really poor. Why? Because longevity is the problem of poverty. It means that you're not going to be done after this month. You need to worry about next month and the month after that and the month after that. This is something that these people cannot be able to experience because they know it's done for a month. Anybody can take basically anything for a month as long as you know it's going to be over after that. And you take it in increments of only a year, right? The problem is not having a fallback. This is why it's so hard for rich people to pretend to be poor. They go, oh, undercover boss trying to live poor for a year. They don't really live poor because they know that after their month spent there, they go back to their rich people houses and forget about this. Because you have a need to disassociate because of exactly OG's analysis of why these experiences feel so bad, you probably don't want to experience them. Yes, you will do drugs for a month and then forget about it because it's your 1 month break of taking free drugs, right? It's wanting to escape the real pain that exists there. Secondarily, on the idea of why this probably creates a counter effect. Look, at the point where you're there in a poor community, the bad side of town, you probably blame other poor people for these living conditions. You're placed in an unfamiliar environment, and you're afraid not of rich mega corporations, you're afraid of the guy who might want to stab you to take your wallet, meaning you blame other poor people for the living conditions of poor people that you are experiencing right now, meaning you probably get the opposite of empathy. You hate poor people for making the lives of other poor people miserable, because these are the people you're most proximately afraid of walking on the bad side of town, right? You're wishing there was more police there. You're wishing somebody was tougher on crime. You're wishing somebody took that guy's knife away so he wouldn't be a threat to you. You want tougher shit because you don't want these poor communities to look the way they do because you're afraid of other poor people there. Secondarily, you have some, by OG's mechanics, you have some idea of what it looks like, some control over this scenario. This probably means you have the ability to invest some limited amounts of money that you have in ways to make your life at least sometimes better, somehow better from day to day. Note, you're not afraid of losing and gambling this money all the way. If you invest it all into stocks, you might go broke, fine, it's over after a month. If you don't go broke, you can have more food. You can experience less of the negative things that exist in this simulation. Meaning some of these people, especially people who are well-versed in business, people who are well-educated, people who are well-spoken, people who know the places within the simulation where to go, where they can get some amount of at least quick cash for at least that 1 month. These are the people who will have an upward trajectory in their experiences, meaning they will blame other poor people for not being able to do the same at the point where they come out of this experience. Well, I made my life better at the end of that month than it was when I started. Why can other people, poor people, not do the same? You have a lack of empathy towards them. Thirdly, on the idea of alternatives, note, opening government's case hinges on the idea that empathy is the core reason why we are not solving poverty. Poverty is not a symptom of capitalism. It is a built-in feature that exists because you need workers to be exploited for the rich to be able to keep getting richer. Even if all of the people are very empathetic, and no, the vast majority of the people have experienced some amount of poverty in their lives, they probably resonate with policies that would help poor people. Nobody is really angry about giving poor people better ideas of housing. Nobody is really angry at the idea of increasing the minimum wage, especially the vast majority of people who do work paycheck to paycheck and work minimum wage. They have empathy towards these people. The problem is that there is rich elites on the top who do not want this to be solved because this is something that they can profit off of. No, OG is not solving poverty. OG is only saying people will feel better about people will empathize more with poor people, not showing the mechanism, how we get tangible mechanisms to solve poverty from that. No, this is an extremely expensive thing to do. Imagine it costs hundreds of millions of dollars in every country just to run elections, and only 60% of people at best show up, and they're only in there for a minute. How expensive is it to have a highly scientific machine running every year so that every person in your country can go there for an hour every single year? This is hundreds of thousands, if not billions of dollars spent every year to run this. These billions of dollars could be spent building poor people housing, giving them food, giving them food stamps, tangibly better solving the problems of poverty that exist in the status quo. There's likely to be at least enough of a support to that people would like, I would like to not be tortured. I would prefer for this money to go to poor people in some way. Before you go on why bodily autonomy is the highest principle right a person can hold, closing, do you have anything?
Okay, if you assume that you have the money to build poor houses, why we cannot actually have the same, if not more, soft capital to actually do this, assuming government is working?
An extreme amount of money to run, and insofar as money is finite, spending money on this is not spending money on something else. Insofar as this is seen as a social project to raise empathy towards poor people, it's likely going to be taken out of the same budget that would build housing to these same poor people. Now, look. This principle works extremely simply. There is a strong asymmetry of power between an individual and the state who is now enforcing this right. You've heard it a bunch of times, but it's really impactful for this debate. The state influences all of the aspects of an individual's life by the policies that it makes: education, healthcare, welfare, labor, right? The material conditions of your existence are dependent on state conditions. The reason these people are poor is because the state allows them to continue to be in poor conditions. So it doesn't give them more housing, doesn't give them more transportation, more education, and whatnot. Your ability to pursue happiness is dependent on the state setting up your adequate solutions for you to be able to do so, to giving you police, the army and whatnot to protect your rights. Consider there is an asymmetry in which the state holds so much power over an individual, but the individual holds all of the information about what they would prefer, what their subjective pursuit of happiness looks like, right? Meaning the state has more power, but less information about the preferences of the individual in that situation. At the point where the state has the power to enforce all of the things on the individual, but does not have access to the preferences of the individual, it is not justified in restricting or enforcing actions upon that person. They cannot reasonably assume would cause harm to other people. E.g., the state can limit my drunk driving because it might hurt other people if I get drunk and hit somebody else, but it cannot but it cannot block me from having my own kidneys inside, even if it inside myself, even if it would help somebody else that they had one of my kidneys. Meaning the state has no right to limit my personal property and my private property, the highest right enshrined in most constitutions. But most of all, the highest level of personal property an individual can hold is the right to self-autonomy. This is why we don't allow organs to be harvested even from dead people, because you have the ability to choose what makes you happy. And this mental torture that you have to experience every month is possibly the worst thing you could be taken about. The state has no right to torture people just so they could be a bit more empathetic. For these reasons, proud to oppose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister to continue saying today's debate. Here.
1 second. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to start with a very quick clarification. When you're in the simulation, you don't know that you're in the simulation. The reason why this is true is because, one, I already explained that this is a dream, which means this is a very fair extrapolation of the model already presented in the PM. When we're in a dream, we don't know that we're in a dream as we're going in through that experience. Secondly, otherwise the motion would be broken, right? Because you could always prepare for this experience of absolute poverty. And insofar as we can make that you remain in absolute poverty for the months that you're in it, it is not possible that there are alternatives that, for example, allow you to cash in and put in the money. It's somewhere else that you can then go access it while you're in the simulation. So it has to be that you have no awareness of being within there. This is important for reasons I'll explain soon. Let's go into the principle before we engage with the clashes that OO tried to attack us on. In terms of the principle, I want to note a few things. The first is the fact that if they can have their cake and eat it too, either this experience is so incredibly impactful on the personal level that empathy and self-interest triggers, or it is not that impactful, in which case it's not clear why it's such a principal harm. We bite the bullet that there is a harm to the individual here. We'll explain why it's important in terms of poverty, but they have to concede that too. Let's explain why even if there's a harm on the individual, this is not a principal harm. Firstly, we do take people's liberty in many ways. The very uncharitable way of setting up the criteria is saying that we prevent them from doing crimes. You know what are other things that are active in are actively the government encroaching upon people's liberties? Taxes that aren't preventing me from doing a specific action, but taking of my ability to do anything that I would otherwise want to do with that money, which is the same thing that you can explain about time and the way that OOs tries to make the difference between what the government is legitimized in doing or not. Or even if you don't like taxes, the military, when there is a threat of something as massive as people's loss of liberty by being conquered by another nation, which is what people in poverty face, we trigger an emergency response that is setting up a military that is making sure that people are conscripted. We think that similarly, we need the emergency force of defending people from poverty through enlisting people into the force of a simulation. We think that if they want to stand for any country having a military, we similarly get to say that on our side, you need to defend them through the force of a simulation. But even if it's not exactly the same as the military, notice that what we're requiring is less substantial than the military, because we don't have people that are enlisted for years on end. And because more importantly, people can never die. Even if they don't like being within the simulation, it can still never limit their agency in the most fundamental extent. They will still continue to live life after that simulation. Thirdly, I also think that I'm going to explain to you where there is happiness that you can derive from that, which in that case will flip them on the utilitarian metric at the end of this speech. Last thing about the principle is that there is no actual distinction between a passive and an actionable thing. So if rich people tell the poor that they cannot live life as they want because they're the ones that are not voting for those that give them welfare policies, or because they're the ones that decide the working conditions under which they work, given that that's true, you're still applying a harm to them. And given that OO can see the criteria is that if you harm another person, we can limit your liberty in the most substantial extent, we think that that still applies under that criteria. Let's talk about why it is that we get more poverty. They have two claims here. The first is the idea that you're scared of the poor, but you're scared of the poor on either side of the house because you see the news of people in Harlem that get robbed, or because you go in the underground and there's a hobo or a lady doing drugs that you're really scared of. It's really fucking awful in SF. Never move to the United States. The difference is that on our side of the house, you also have positive relationships with poor people, right? Because you form friendships, and because probably in part of that simulation, you go to the centers that poor people hang out around, or you have a family that you're somewhat connected to. The deadlock breaker here is then that on their side, you're only exposed to the bad connections. On our side, you both have the positive ones, but you're also probably spending more time with the positive connections because you want to move away from people that you don't like and spend more time with those that do charitable actions towards you and those that you do love. So that impression actually changes. The second thing that they say is it's done in a month. And why does that trigger then empathy? The first thing I want to note is, even if it's not that awful to you as a person, not everyone is as self-absorbed as OO describes. What we tell you is that the problem in the status quo is that they don't understand what it means to be in poverty, because descriptiveness can never work as much to explain to me what I need to spend my money. This is why we need an extent of understanding the urgency of what poverty is. When people donated to Ukraine and when they were willing to cut ties with Russia despite having disastrous economic impacts to their own country, it was because they understood more what it means to be a Ukrainian refugee than they do in Africa, than they do for refugees in Africa. This difference in urgency is when people start donating. But secondly, even if they're self-interested, when rich and middle income people make the following calculation, I can either spend 1 out of 12 part of my life living in conditions that aren't as awful, not feeling hungry, or I can buy a new yacht. You know what suddenly makes more sense? To make it so the worst of the experiences are avoided. So suddenly my money, by diminishing returns, is more worth it when I invest into avoiding that 1 out of 12 part of my life just being better. So even from a self-interested perspective, I have this wish. The third and last thing that I want to say in terms of poverty is the following thing. We dissuade people from all sorts of conservative narratives. The idea that you cannot be helped, and that you cannot be helped if you don't help yourself, and that you've gotten yourself to this scenario is quickly dissuaded and outside of the house. The reason for this is because, unlike what OO say, you don't know what it means to be poor because you've never been poor before, which means you don't know where to go in order to get cash. All that you know is that if you quit work, you'll have no way of buying food, and if you stop paying for the crappy apartment that you live in and that requires fixing all of the time, you'll be living in the street. So you see how stuck you are in a way which doesn't ever help you and allow you to get out of your own situation. Second half. Okay, I want to weigh less poverty above anything else. 1, less poverty for poor people means something much more substantial than than feeling worse for the people that go through the simulation. Because poor people can die. Poor people can experience sexual abuse. And these are the sorts of things that leave triggers that will remind me of the experience that I had every hour of my life. It's the sorts of things that we would sacrifice so much money in order to prevent people to go into in court trials today that require an immense amount of money, but we still think that it's worth it. Secondly, poor people have children. These children have to go through these experiences and experience them as most intensely because we view everything as much bigger when we are a child. Given that poor people also tend to have more children than the richer and the middle income, we think that we're saving their families to a greater extent. Thirdly, it's also a question of logical precedence. If you help the poor people, if you make it so their situation isn't that bad, if there's a shelter that they can go to in the evening to get food, then the experience of being in the simulation in the long term won't be that bad, so trauma won't be that bad from being in the simulation in the long term. So at best, their impact is short-term panic. For all those reasons, OG.
Great, I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to a deputy leader of opposition to continue your side in today's debate. Here.
Okay, I'll take POIs in chat. If I forget to take one around 5:45, you can just unmute yourself. I would preferably like to take it from back up. So yeah, okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Right, OG has 2 framings. If you buy Ayal's framing, and this is a little Ayal in broke Israel, and you have to run and you have to live like this, that means that you enter into this simulation with your moral perception of poverty and these sort of particular things, and then you perceive these people as weirdos that want to steal from you, and then you're afraid of them. Or you buy Amitai's framing, that is just a dream sequence, and insofar this is a dream sequence, you perceive this as something distant, right? You don't perceive your dreams as something that's like within your moral system, within your emotional system, and then they just shoot yourself in then they just shoot themselves in the leg and don't prove the comparative or the tipping point on their side of the house for empathy, right? A few points of rebuttal clearly towards OG. I think firstly, I think the thing I'll flag right now, and I'll talk about more later, is why it's a problem. Why poverty in and of itself is problematic when you're inside of it, right? Why insofar you're inside of poverty, you will perceive this as a paranoid thing, as a thing, as an emotional response, and won't create the empathy in and of itself. But the more important thing that I want to give as an extraneous response is that their case only works insofar you have the capacity to try to change something. I'm not sure how this capacity looks like, right? Maybe if they want to run, you volunteer and do these sort of particular things, I'm not sure that this is impactful. Probably just think that you're doing enough and not actually doing anything. If they want to prove political change and do these particular things, I'm not sure that people choose to vote differently, because probably the people that they want to talk about is people who are voting right-wing, center-right now, that these are political parties that is not helping the poor, not giving social programs and these sort of particular things. The reason why these people are doing it, the way that they justify themselves not voting for center-left people, that they perceive that center-right or more liberal economies will boost the economy and make the economy better and thus help the poor people, right? So I'm not sure why these people will vote for social programs, because they believe that the liberal economic policies help the poor. They believe in trickle-down economics and these sort of things, regardless of whether this works or not, or whatever. And I think that in a lot of cases, also left-wing politicians just maybe have their corruption scandals inside of themselves, right? Maybe this is a reason why they don't want to vote for them, and they want right now. Maybe there's extraneous reasons why they don't want to vote for these particular parties, maybe because of their social stances and these sort of particular things. There's a lot of things that come into the way that you want to, or your choice of voting for a particular party. They don't prove the tipping point for you voting for this specific one. So I think that we remove the capacity or their thought of actually having the capacity to try to do something. Thirdly, and most importantly, you probably numb yourself within this process, right? Okay, regardless of whose framing you buy, I think you can buy that you likely know that this ends and this is it. But no, this is an immense amount of stress that you have not felt before, right? This means that you're just likely to depersonalize yourself and suppress this, right? Especially if this is a dream sequence, right? And if this is a very bad dream, right? If you have a nightmare, you suppress it, you don't think about it, you move on with your life, right? So I think this is probably the more respectable response that people are likely to have, then you don't think about it in these sort of particular cases. So how will these people perceive this, and why will this be inherently problematic? Note, insofar you are not poor, you probably just have a different moral system. You think of stealing in a different kind of way. This is something that happens a lot inside of poverty communities, because of course you need to live, you need to steal to live, and these sort of things. So you probably perceive yourself getting robbed and being attacked. You probably perceive your friends, the same thing happening to your friends, or your friends robbing other people, right? Note, you're still you inside of that stimulation, and you'll probably see stealing as wrong and these sort of particular things. The problem with this is twofold. Firstly, you just perceive that this is the issue, right? Know that inside of liberal circles, we can look at people, we can look at like cycles of poverty and other people stealing from each other from an objective perspective. You can see, of course, they want to do this because they want to survive. But if you're the victim of that, if you're a victim of any crime, you cannot look at it objectively. You cannot look at this, these people need social programs and we need to help them, we need rehabilitation. You probably want to vote for more policing in these neighborhoods and these sort of particular things, because you believe that these people need to be contained to some sort of particular thing, which probably just hurts these neighborhoods even more, right? You probably the extra policing doesn't really help these sort of communities. Firstly, and secondly, you probably just create a phobia in and of itself, right? You got fucking robbed, right? This is a paranoid response in and of itself, right? It's something that you don't like, and you just probably like to distance yourself from it. Which, because of the way your brain works, if you have a certain trauma that happened to you, you would generalize this trauma and you try to stay away from these people. And you probably just become phobic of different poor people, because you start to over exaggerate your chance of being robbed by a person that appears to be homeless and these sort of particular things. Insofar people have an initial emotional response of these sort of particular things, they probably want to stay away from them. They do not want to volunteer in these circles. They don't want to go there and give them cash because they're afraid that they'll get attacked and these sort of particular things. Before I go on to the principle, I want to take closing.
You say proximity of where you're voting is not changing, but then you say you have a whole campaign about how you're going to fear these kind of poor people and you're going to have more police. You have to pick and choose if people are changing their votes.
Yeah, no. The rebuttal we gave is that you perceive that you're already doing enough by voting for right-wing by right-wing policies, and this doesn't then substantially change this sort of particular thing. So maybe you're more for over-policing these sort of particular things, but you probably already perceive yourself that you're doing more in the status quo and for not voting for left-wing parties in these particular things. Plus, I gave extreme reasons why you probably don't vote, why you don't want to vote for left-wing politicians. Why? Now, why is bodily autonomy the most important thing? I think that we already kicked out why this probably doesn't help people, why this creates backlash in and of itself. But I think even if this gives particular benefits, we don't believe that you can force empathy in this sort of particular way. Because note, your body is the only way that you can access your subjective perception of happiness. The only way that the state can give you a leeway to try to perceive these sorts of particular things. So we believe that even if this tries to give some sort of empathy, we believe that you don't have a moral obligation to try to do this particular thing, right? Because note, insofar the state tries to limit this, you cannot do other things and try to access your particular way of perception of happiness. OG says, you already do taxation, but motherfucker, taxation helps you, right? It gives you roads, it gives you healthcare and these sort of particular things. This doesn't give you anything in response, right? So I think that not only does this mean that this is principally true, but I think that because people are likely to perceive it this way, you're probably just more likely to get angry at the people that are giving this to you, angry at the people who are actively torturing you, and not try to build more empathy. We believe that this is a more proximate response for people, so probably a more likely response, and for these reasons,
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech and for a wonderful top half. I'd like to go for the extension speaker from side closing government to open the bottom half in today's debate. Here.
Okay. Am I audible?
You sound like a robot, but yes, you are audible.
Okay. I'm audible now.
Yeah, like it's the same. It's fine.
Okay, fuck it. Why not?
Will you hear our POIs though?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
The world of opening opposition is the opposite of government. There is already narratives against the poor. Most people have pre-existing biases against the poor for multiple structural reasons we're going to give you in closing government. In closing government, we're going to break the deadlock and basically explain you two things. One, incentive from the government to use poor people. We think that
you stopped for a long time. Maybe we should turn off the cameras and restart.
Okay. Now what did we?
Yeah.
Okay.
You better restart. Like
we think.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
We think the world of opposition is the opposite of the simulation. We can't live in simulation where we view only the positive things of riches. We only have negative affirmations towards the poor. This, for multiple structural reasons, we're going to give you in closing government. Two things from closing government. One, why the government has an active incentive to fix the problem. But two, why people are not going to hurt poor people. We think opening government has taken a bigger bet than they should. What does opening government do? Two things. One, they say why donations and policy increases, but we are uncertain why people are going to act positively and not just what opening opposition says, why people are just not going to do anything because of the already stuff that they have in their lives. The second thing they say is that your principle is justified because there are more poor people and they suffer more. We think that, sure, yes, this is the case, but this is not debate winning, this is just defensive analysis, right? Going to the vertical. Why the government has a direct incentive to push for more change? We think this for two particular reasons. One, they need to justify the measure that they are trying to push. This is because they need to make it more palatable. This is because they need to basically make it so that it is not like torturing the population every year. This means that they're likely to have some propaganda behind it every time it happens. Like, this is your national duty. Like, this is like something you're doing for the future generations or something like that. Make it like sort of nationalist. This means that the perception you're going to have in society most times, at least from the top down, is a positive one, at least in order to limit the political cost the government has towards running this policy. Secondly, we think politicians themselves that have been through the simulation have one, more nuance when it comes to specifically the poor, but secondly, they have more imagery and iconography that they can use their campaigns in order to provoke people in order to act. This means that leftist politicians or like centrist politicians have more iconography that makes people feel the stuff. But secondly, it means that right-wing politicians, when they push for like very negative imagery of the poor, most times there is backlash towards the minds of the people. Therefore, it means the political cost for the government to push for policy that helps the poor decreases. Notice two things. One, this does not mean necessarily that policy passes, but the burden for policy to pass decreases, which means in the long term, with the tipping points like crisis or the aversion of crisis, I don't know, where you're more likely to pass policy, more policies that help the poor passes. This is a much lower burden than what opening government is taking, which is like somehow poor people start voting for the poor. And secondly, it also like kind of breaks the deadlock that opening opposition is trying to push, that the government is going to do nothing about it because there is in the capitalist system. We give you like a reason why they're going to do it. Okay, going the case. We decrease abuse towards the poor because we create opposite perspectives towards the already pre-existing narratives. Why there are already pre-existing narratives against the poor? Three reasons. We think that there are one, capitalistic narratives, that it is your own choice to be poor, or you have a specific choice to climb up the structure. Notice that these narratives are like very much into the system, either through movies, like the one with Will Smith and his son, I don't remember the name, or like all of the narratives we have about billionaires and how they're self-made. Secondly, many people, there is an escaped status towards the people that are poor and have left the poverty trap. This is either immigrants have left like developing countries or like poor people in their own country that have gone out of this. They believe that they had the power to do so, therefore others also had it and did not use it. Therefore, there is a direct burden towards people that are poor in that system. But thirdly, I think there are a lot of stereotypes, jokes against poor people. These like pure Dave Chappelle skits about like drug addicts or like basic jokes that are happening in like groups. This means that there is already a lot of narrative against the perspective of the poor, but secondly, note that narrative does not come from the poor people themselves. Therefore, the information and the nuance of those narratives is very much lacking. This creates a distorted image of how poor people are viewed. Why this narrative then affects poor people's daily life? Two reasons. One is because you consider them a fault or an error in the system. This means that when you step out of your building and there is a homeless person, you think that they're violating your own private property, which they could have a choice not to. Therefore, you most likely act violently against them. This either you do it like through establishing things like how is it called, aggressive infrastructure in buildings, like having no benches or like removing things like so rain falls upon them, or like actively calling the police in order for them to leave. But secondly, the system itself is built in a way that is hostile towards the poor people. This is like lack of benches in cities, or like just the police being actively aggressive towards them. I'll take over in a bit. So why the perspective of these changes? Fuck it, I'll take over now.
It is possible that right-wing economy is the best way to solve poverty. Do you really think that torturing every single person, even those who are already poor now, to make them vote a certain way, may not even solve the problem, is really justified?
Okay, let's be honest. Most times, voting does not change. What we say is that political capital for policy that helps the poor decreases. Therefore, yes, you can take opening government off. Why the perspective after the simulation happens changes? Two reasons. One, you gain nuance. This is important. Most people already have empathy towards the poor. This is because it's kind of intuitive. People are starving, I need to protect them. But they do not have the specific knowledge on how they're directly violating them. They do not understand that a person being outside their door and them making them leave because they're afraid they might violate their own private property or because they might be a risk to their lives, means that there is direct damage to them. Therefore, they gain the specific information they were lacking that is intrinsic, that they could not otherwise have out of this experience. But secondly, this experience also happens to people that are in power of things, like police officers or architects or people that have control over the ability and the pain that these people are feeling. Therefore, they have power in order to change it. But thirdly, we tell you that most times when they are not going to act violently after this passage because they have seen the experience. But secondly, the reason when they act positively towards them, like donate their clothes and stuff like that, is mostly due to virtue signaling. It's like them trying to like get rid of the guilt that they feel from like torturing these poor people from experiencing that in the simulation. This means that there are specific tipping points where you're triggered. When you see a homeless person outside your door, when you see a homeless person inside the metro, when like you view these advertisements that the politicians might make in a vertical, the impacting. I think this is like huge impacts. It is like stuff like not like having more benches in cities so poor people can live, all the way to like police not beating them up when there is somebody because they have been through that experience. For all of the above reasons, vote closing government.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the opposition member to continue to open their side in today's debate. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Great. I guess somehow I am going to regret saying that you could record me because of what I'm about to say. So that's fun. Okay. Wonderful. I am, one sec, going to start as soon as I've opened my stopwatch. So I am going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Nomi assures me that I can say the following and still win the debate. Governments just never prove to us that welfare, giving charity, etc., is the best way to actually improve public quality of life, including for the poor. We're going to show how the entire economy and society are going to suffer due to this policy, and I think that that's going to end up being more significant than welfare policy and charity, even if Gov were right. But also, we just don't have to support more welfare just because we're debaters. Go us. Great. Let's talk about why the simulator causes disproportionate harm, talking about how this harms the participant and why this is disproportionate, giving a couple of actual pieces of analysis there, and why this is also just a bad idea because it has high social costs. Great. So let's get started. How does it actually harm the participant? 1, I think this is likely to actually cause long-term trauma. Now, I'm not saying trauma as a large umbrella term. I'm talking actual post-traumatic stress. Let's understand what causes post-traumatic stress and how this specifically does that. Number 1, I think you need to have something bad happen to you. OG basically conceded this already, like begging, starving, being addicted to drugs, losing your loved ones to violence, etc. These are things that have a massive impact on your psyche. Great. 2nd, helplessness. When you are unable to actually affect the events going on around you. For example, if you were in a war and you see somebody next to you being blown up and you couldn't do anything about it, or you were shot and you were helpless to stop yourself from being shot, or that's how you felt, this causes post-traumatic stress. You know what we've been told over and over again in this debate? You can't change your situation. It doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter how you try, you are helpless. You will remain poor for the entirety of this month, no matter what or how you try to affect your circumstance. You are just a passenger in your body living a poor life. Thirdly, loss of time and location. The final part of what leads to post-traumatic stress is post-traumatic stress disorders is losing a sense of grounding. You don't know where you are in comparison to the world. You keep on going back in time to being in, I don't know, in my case, it would be Sajaiya, I guess, or wherever I would have supposed to have been. But like, you go back to the place where this terrible thing actually happened, and you're never actually able to successfully close the loop on the event. It never really finished. This is exactly what side government are proposing when you're constantly reliving a similar scenario, unable to avoid it, but it's not quite the same, and there are always subtle differences that you cannot quite understand, so you're constantly living in like this mixed kind of living dream where once a year you have a month which is kind of similar and kind of isn't, so it's never grounded in your actual reality. We think that this already shows that you've gotten post-traumatic stress disorder, but we think that it's also likely to get even worse when you are likely to repress some of these memories. You're likely to be unsure which memories are even relevant, so you don't remember which wife is from which month, which is from which life, which makes you feel terrible and means you don't understand what you're leaving, and it often causes flashbacks and other kinds of PTSD symptoms. Why is this already enough to win us the debate? I think this is just disproportionate for 3 reasons. 1, the constant harm that people are likely to suffer. PTSD is awful. And when you're spending most of your days trying to deal with PTSD, I don't care if you end up helping some poor people some of the time. You need to show a lot more than that to justify it. Secondly, I think that the trauma side effects themselves are terrible. You have difficulty creating attachments with your kid because you're worried that they're going to die or get shot because they were black in your dream. You have an inability to get out of your shell at work and go forward because you're worried to be taken advantage of or ignored because you're a woman and were poor. You have an unwillingness to ask for help from the cops because you remember how your friend in the dream was sexually harassed by a cop because you couldn't do anything. So this literally affects your daily life as well. Secondly, I also just think this leads to extreme, like the edge cases here, the potential harm is awful, right? People who suffer from actual PTSD do things like commit suicide or have to be on constant drugs or things like that. So even if most people won't suffer that, we don't know who will, and it's unjust to subject people to an experience that could lead them to have this kind of response, and we think would be a totally reasonable response for a subset. I don't know, what is it, like 5 to 10% of people who go to war suffer from these kinds of things? That's a pretty big thing to force people to go and do. Thirdly, it's also, and I also think finally is a burden that opening government and closing government had to meet, which they never did. And that is harm is always relative to necessity. We don't harm people if we don't have to. Notice, we can achieve empathy with loads of other methods. Meeting with one-on-one with poor people would be one way of doing this, that we could force people to just have a one-on-one. We could do forced volunteer days. We could do film education. We could do literally a million things that would make you identify more with poor people in general and more likely to help them that don't involve torturing you. Cool. Why is this also a bad idea? Because it has a high social cost. I don't actually have to meet the burden of literal trauma to say that this was a very, very difficult month. It involved a lot of hardship. And when people suffer a lot for a month, it is incredibly draining and difficult for them, both physically and mentally. And this normally means that as a response, they are more likely to do things like take time off or be less effective at work or just need time with themselves in order to be able to do these things. Let's impact that. This means you, A, lose productivity. What happens when you lose productivity? This means you're likely to see something like, I don't know, people take 7 extra sick days a month off because of this kind of effect. What does that look like? 1, you're losing the services they provide. This means you don't necessarily have enough bus drivers. You don't have doctor's appointments because doctors are taking breaks. You're losing all the money and taxes that would have been generated as salary and labor, which would have gone directly to building infrastructure that serves everyone, including the poor, and I don't know, like literally direct benefits to the poor. But also I'm going to talk about the interpersonal level after I take a POI from opening.
So only your first mech shows trauma, the other shows at best confusion. The problem with your first mech is that it changes on our side of the house because you have shelters.
Okay, listen, PTSD is created by 3 levels of things, which were the ones that I described, which is a bad thing that happens to you, inability to then close the loop so then you constantly relive it, and a loss of grounding, which prevents you from being able to stop carrying on reliving it. I showed all 3 of those, which is why I got post-trauma, which is why it's a very, very significant, constant harm that happens in a loop. Now, on the interpersonal level, I also think that when you're upset, it's also just much harder to interact with or help others when you're drained in this way. Think about it. When you've had a bad day or are depressed, you aren't nice to your surroundings. You snap a lot more. What does this mean? A, this has a cost for social action. This means that people are just, in general, less nice to each other and obviously to poor people day to day. They snap at their waiter when they're delayed. They snap at the cleaner when they leave a speck of dust or things like that, which means that they are, in general, less nice to everyone around them. Secondly, they have less mental space to devote to causes. Even if they technically care about the causes more, they just don't have the effort to do anything more. This means like I'm sitting in bed trying to recover instead of going out to volunteer on the ground or spending time with my friend and helping my loved ones or babysitting for my newborn siblings or all those kinds of things, which are both helpful for people close to me, but also for poor people. We win. Thank you so much.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I like to do the floor to the Gov Whip. Let's close the camera because we don't know if it will collapse.
Actually, am I audible because we're moving things around? I'm sorry for the inconvenience, by the way.
No worries, no worries. Yes, you're audible.
Give me 1 second because we're moving stuff and I can start. Okay, start my speech. 3, 2, 1. For CO case to run, you have to assume, panel, or maybe Ruben, that this will be done in a so fucked up way that the government will actually target people to make them like physically incapable of doing anything, by the way, right? But the second thing is that you have to buy that, like, living an experience in a first person like way is something that will change your calculus in the way that you behave so much that video games and play Call of Duty will make you to an assassin. I think CEO's debate and analysis is kind of insane, and I don't think they meet their burden of proof to prove that you're going to be so in PTSD situation that you won't be able to cope and to actually have this kind of like interaction with society, be able to go to work and stuff like that. I think that was my intro for CEO being insane in this debate. But then I'm going to do two things in my speech. One, I'm going to attack OO, especially the principle and the only practical case they have, by the way, which is, you have more policing and there's more likelihood of lobbying to be more afraid of poor people. And then I'm going to weigh off with OG explaining why, even if they have proven some type of empathy, I don't think they have proven why it is likely you're going to act on this empathy, right? And how this like action will look like, which is the extension of Panagis. First, attacking more CEO, right? And why they're probably not irrelevant, but like kind of crazy in this round. One, they say you're going to have a constant harm and the side effects are going to be immense, that you won't be able to dissociate from this kind of reality. Three things here. One, I think OG and probably CG is giving you more realistic approach on why this will happen in a good way. Governments want to be elected. Governments don't want to stigmatize and actually fuck up citizens. Therefore, you have every incentive to use the fiat, the technology, the psychotherapist, the fucking dopamine drugs, and give them cocaine, I don't know what, to be able to dissociate and to be able to be actually snap out of this kind of situations, right? The moment, I guess there's going to be isolation for some hours before you can actually dissociate and you can come back to reality. There are going to be specific techniques too. There are going to be specific techniques from psychotherapists that are going to help you cope and understand that you're not the person who was actually doing the stuff. PTSD specifically on military, because the shock is so immense that you had to pull the trigger. This is entirely different because you're not a person that is actually been in the simulation. You're not like Thomas living in the street. You're actually George. And the proximity of your life and the things that you have done and how you identify as a person is significantly different. Therefore, I think the tipping point of the PTSD being so fucked up inside closing opposition is insane. I concede to an extent. You're going to be shocked. You're going to be traumatized to an extent. But we think that's a good thing. And we reflect that on CG because we think the mockery and the abuse and the ignorance of how these people are actually failing is significant on side opposition, and you have to do something about it. So yes, we trade off some trauma and that we despair, and we spare it out to different citizens because we have a moral obligation to maximize safety of all citizens. And therefore, we bury some citizens with some trauma in order to maximize safety of other citizens that are more vulnerable. More of that on my weighing. Fuck these people, they're not being quiet. Okay. Two, I think they say then, oh my God, productivity is going to be so fucked up and you won't be able to go to work and you're going to miss doctor appointments and you have to overload your work. I think all of this is practical things that government can compensate, right? Panagis gives you analysis on why people are going to give you lobbying, they're going to give you campaigns on why this is a good thing to do. I think people are going to be curious. They're going to have specific vacation from their work because the government has an incentive to do this in a good way, right? So I think people are going to be curious to take a week off and to actually snap into this, right? So you go in for a few hours and then you have a week to actually process what happened. Three, I think all this is also a positive case on our side of the house. You have more public discourse about it. You're discussing with your friends, with your family. You're discussing in lobbies and stuff like that. How was this experience? This maximization of representation and actually being relatable and relevant to the status quo is insane on side of proposition to actually have more soft capital to do something about it. By the way, now moving to OG, we're not contingent on proving huge things like OG saying, the way that you're going to vote is going to shift and the public and the global poor are going to be eliminated like both sales pitch and stuff like that. We think we're more realistic on to prove marginal case about how the physical interactions are the most relevant throughout this round. Two reasons why the comparative of when you see them in the street is the most realistic comparison to actually adjudicate this debate are reasonable. One, the trigger factor that all teams are actually proving. I think OG's missing link is to explain why this is long lasting. They say descriptiveness is not enough, and they don't say nothing else on the lasting effect of how your calculus and how you're not actually acting only on critical junctures, but you're acting on daily life about the poor. I think this is not proven OG. So we say the following. Probably you won't change your behavior when it comes to different calculus and different abbreviations when it comes to your life. You're going to specifically change the way you behave when you meet poor people, right? So I think this is the case where Panagis case makes more sense, right? Because one, he's proving that people in the street are going to be less abused, they're going to be less mocked down, they're going to be less looked down. You want to kick their thing, the cup with the thing they have with like coins in it, right? You want point on them and you blame them for the systemic problems that actually exist. All of this kind of mental shifting in the mental capacity is giving these poor people a better chance of actually coping in the street. Let's weigh now why money that may be proven on OG is less relevant as to actually having this kind of safety and the shift to narratives. Before that, better.
We can show people videos and stories of real people who suffer poverty and cause a significant amount of empathy. And we can do this without infringing on the basic human dignities of every adult, even those who are already poor or help the poor. Even if you torture them, people will still vote the same way they do because they think it solves poverty. You're torturing people and making them more afraid of the poor in your side of the house.
Okay. One, I don't think you have the fear to prove that you're going to have people sitting down watching videos. But then two, you're not having the fear that's definitely to force them and to coerce them to actually process what they see, right? So the fundamental difference between the two sides is that you don't have an opt-out opinion of actually opt-on option to actually leave this thing, right? So it's entirely different to say you're going to have one-on-one as COR per OO have these videos. And it's entirely different to actually like leave this and to actually feel the calculus and how you feel about it, right? So what we say is the following. We think, one, the fundamental shift is when these people are feeling safer and when it comes to like people actually respecting them. I think fear and policing by OO is flipped on CG. And we say, fuck yes, that's a good thing. You should be afraid of the poor people. You shouldn't look down on them and you shouldn't actually feel like that you have the audacity to actually like, you know, just ignore them or like do anything else. Feeling like actually fearing them is less likely to actually for you to engage to bad behavior, right? It is more likely out of fear that you're gonna give some coins and go away, rather than that you're actually gonna kick them down or actually piss on where they sit and stuff like that. All these abuses are actually happening in the status quo, and they're actually problematic for these people because they don't have any kind of privacy to be able to sit and sleep on specific stuff. I don't think policing is also an inherent problem on opening opposition. Opening opposition only have a principle of autonomy that is attacked by OG, but we think that we also attack this principle by explaining why you have a moral obligation to maximize safety of these people and being the vulnerables. I think you can trade that off from having a bad experience or like some trauma on side opposition. For all of the above reasons, and because we're standing for the little guy, proud to be CG. Vote us.
Great. I thank that speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the opposition whip to end today's debate. Here.
Thank you very much. Just a sec. Beginning now. I think we win this debate because A, we show that this is an illegitimate extent of harm given to people without any reasonable justification provided by governments as to why we would be harming people in this way. And second, because we show that the actual outcomes of this policy probably harm all of society to a great extent, and even those very poor people that governments care about so much to a very great extent. Let's get into it. First, I'd like to respond to this pushback from CG of, oh, people won't be traumatized because we have fiat. I think A, it's too little too late for fiat, but B, I think even if you can show that there will be efforts to somehow mitigate the negative effects of this experience, given the way that it was characterized to us as a experience that you feel was really yours and one that you remember and stays with you and one where you experience really negative things, I don't think you can then say magic fiat, those aren't harms to a person and people don't react to that the way that human beings react to that. So, worse, at best, you slightly mitigate the harms. I don't think you remove them, and I think Yeshai's case stands very significantly. Let's get into the clashes. First off, on the issue of legitimacy. What do we hear from OO? OO basically say you can't take people's bodily autonomy. It belongs to them. The government isn't allowed to intervene or take anything from them in that aspect. And it's pointed out rather correctly that, yes, the government can, and there are fair instances where we think it is legitimate for the government to do so, such as compulsory military service, such as taking your taxes and your property, and so forth. This is all we get from OG. OG only pushed back on this OO claim by showing there is some reason for us to do this harm, and sometimes you're allowed to harm. What does Yeshai come and show you? He shows, A, that this is an extreme harm, that this is a very significant harm that is going to remain with people throughout their time, even after the simulator, and inhibit their ability to function and cause them a lot of suffering. But he also he explains how he goes through and analyzes why this is likely going to be a PTSD response. Not just says, oh, it's traumatic, but actually shows that these are negative experiences that you have no way of resolving or responding to, and that you are either going to be forced to repress them and deal with the fact that your mind is repressing a very significant memory and the dissonance that creates, or you're going to be constantly reliving these memories in a way that inhibits your ability to think or function because you are constantly in a fear state. HUJI also demonstrates that the metrics for needing to harm people as a government aren't met here. We are not creating any kind of general public service that is needed by the country and therefore is illegitimate to collect resources of any kind from the general public in order to create. This isn't a resource. This is a mind-washing attempt. But second, there doesn't show that there is a necessity of doing it in this way. Unlike a military that just doesn't function unless you have soldiers, it is not clear that in order to create societal change, in order to support poor people, or even in order to create empathy toward poor people, what you have to do is put people through a traumatic experience and make them suffer. There's just no reasoning given to that, and it is very likely that you could achieve similar, if not better effects, not doing so. Therefore, we think that we win on legitimacy. And obviously, if we show that this is an illegitimate act on the state, then even if it does give us some benefits, we think that this entire motion should not stand. And we do a lot more on legitimacy than OO. Let's get into the societal effects. But first, let's take a POI from top half, if there is one. No? Okay.
So how do you ever weigh against people in the streets dying or being sexually abused? A bit of trauma for a month doesn't equate to a lifetime of that.
Perhaps not, but then again, you are doing this to all of the citizens of a country, whereas I think only very small proportion of people are in absolute poverty and experiencing those sorts of horrific things that you're describing. I would say that it's just not worth harming that many individuals because of that one person that's being harmed. I would also say that it is not actually directly their fault that one person is being harmed, so that still makes it illegitimate to force all that suffering on them in order to compensate for that one person's harm. And I would argue there are better ways of helping that person. I think all of these respond to your POI. Let's move on to the societal effects. First, say either, this isn't going to make you any more sympathetic because you won't care and you'll just ignore this experience and move on, which I think if we accept the OG mech and if we accept OO's other cases, this does affect you. You are interacting with it. You are remembering it to some extent. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. But second, as a debate. Second, they say, you're going to have a fear of poor people, which also means that they do think you internalize the experience. And they say that, but the thing is, when they say this fear, the impacts that they give us for this are twofold. You will avoid poor people or poor areas, which I just don't know why that's a harm. I don't know why we need people who are more affluent to be visiting poor areas and why that's a benefit or a good thing, or why they would be doing this if they haven't experienced this, because at best, they're not afraid, but they just have no reason to go there. And at worst, they're probably afraid even if they haven't gone through the simulation. And I think that then the second thing we're told is, it's going to create more policing, which again, is just asserted that's a bad thing when you have more policing in poor areas. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. I would argue that if your experience of a month of being poor is, I wish there were more police around, it's quite possible that poor people would benefit from having more police around and having less crime in their area, and that this would be a positive thing. Let's move on to governments. GovBench say, you're going to act for change, you're going to vote for welfare, you're going to give more charity. First off, I don't think that they show that this happens to a significant enough extent in order to actually remove people from absolute poverty. And some of the motivation for this, aside from empathy, is, you want to avoid having a really bad simulation. But unless you can prevent absolute poverty from existing, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to actually improve your simulation. That's not an incentive. And I think that probably this isn't going to be a bigger voting issue for people than things that directly affect them. So even if they will be more likely to vote for welfare, that's not what's going to decide who they vote for, right? They're still going to vote based on what's going to affect them, whether we go to war, what the economy is going to look like, etc. And the same goes for maybe they'll give a bit of their money to charity, but most people aren't willing to give huge amounts of their money to charity because they're not that generous, even to people they're very empathetic with. Even in the instance of Ukraine, which apparently we were also empathetic to, I don't think anyone here gave like a month's income to Ukraine. Maybe I'll be surprised. Next, They don't explain that this is the best way to help people in poverty. Welfare is inefficient, it discourages effort, it breeds inflation, and it's spent badly by the poor. We think that improving the economy by having people function at work and be nice to each other and produce goods and pay taxes is more likely to actually lift people up, because there's more money for infrastructure and for creating jobs and actually giving people opportunities. Please oppose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech and for a wonderful debate. Please virtually cross the floor, shake hands. I think I'll take about 5 minutes and then I'll have your OA. So, thank you very much. This was a very good debate. Like, must be the best part I've ever judged. And I'm not saying this to just, be nice in front of the video. I genuinely believe this. Ultimately, the call is as follows. Very clearly, first to closing opposition. After that, second to opening government. Very narrowly to opening opposition. And again, very narrowly, although not as narrow as top half, closing government. So, why is this the call? What do we get from opening government? There are many reasons as to why people will experience the full extent of poverty, and after that they are going to want to take action, whether it's pushing for political change, individual actions, or just being generally nice to individuals. Some of these reasons are very well explained, some of these reasons are a bit asserted, but generally this is the blunt of the case. I won't go through each and every one of these reasons, but they go along the lines of, if you haven't experienced this, and once you now experience, you'll most likely know. Opening opposition tries to punch a bunch of holes into this reasoning and actually flip this claim by claiming, no, the response will most likely be negative rather than positive. Each of the holes that opening opposition is able to punch are fair criticisms towards the opening government mechanism, in terms of it not being long enough, in terms of maybe the experience not being that harsh enough in order to cause this reaction, etc., etc. However, when we get to the mechanism that comes from the opening opposition in terms of the situation getting worse, it goes along the lines of people's reaction being negative. The justification for why the reaction being negative firstly seems to not be asymmetrical in the debate, i.e., it is a reaction that the people who would go into this simulation, based on the government's characterization, already seem to have in the debate, i.e. them being more mad, them thinking that people are to blame and things like that. And it's something that opening opposition doesn't necessarily have a good answer for. Why on the comparative will this be likely to be, why the reaction will likely to be good. There are attempts to point out to alternative policy that the government could do, which is fine, but I personally as a judge do not see the connection between alternative policy and the reaction of this. Given that's the case, then at best this is a lot of good pushback towards the opening government case, but not so much as a flip in order to make the case fall under the other side, absent this comparative argumentation. Then the only other case that comes from the opening opposition is either this may likely lead to over-policing, but I'm not sure why this is a bad thing. This is never justified within the debate, and it's just a word that's given the debate, so I don't necessarily create this as a harm. Similar to how I don't necessarily create welfare as a benefit unless it is explained to me why welfare is a benefit. The second thing is a justification around bodily autonomy that, to be honest, the way you analyze this bodily autonomy claim sounds to me like the government doesn't necessarily has the right to take my autonomy. However, the government has right to take it in some other circumstances that you point out to, and I'm not particularly sure where the line either continues or breaks, and it's not very clearly explained. Versus a specific weighing from the government side where they explain, look, even if we entrench on your autonomy to a certain extent, the impacts that are to poor people and the consequences towards them are far greater than this, and this is something that we would gladly trade off. They also give a couple of examples that it seems like opening opposition also agrees with are true, about trading off the autonomy of individuals towards societal benefit and things like that. So because of all of these reasons, opening opposition loses to opening government. Obviously, you guys said some other things. I don't in this OA, I don't credit everything. I just credit what is the most important thing towards the clash as I saw it. So don't be mad that I didn't say about your one-liner response or something like that. Bringing closing government to the debate. Closing government's case goes along the lines of, there are many processes that could be possible to happen in a situation where this policy is implemented that crystallize and visualize a bit more the case coming from opening government, but aren't necessarily a substantial contribution to the debate. I.e., all of your contributions about how this could change and when this could change are contingent on this changing, right? So in order for me to buy your case, I need to ask myself, okay, but why would the incentives of voters and individuals change within the debate? Well, this justification comes in opening government. So your first part of the extension, although not completely derivative, is not a meaningful contribution to the clash to begin with. The second idea about norms and how people view things and stuff like that, firstly, again, follows the exact same problem, which is, again, it's contingent on people changing their opinions, which is analysis by opening government. But secondly, the way you analyze the problem and the way it personally seems to me means that most likely this is not something that will change in the debate, i.e. you point to a problem, but the problem, the stereotypes that we have about poor people are so severe that I don't necessarily understand whether or not us opting into this machine or not opting into this machine will meaningfully change our incentive systems or not. So because you have these issues, it's very, very hard to create you with an extension. And given that's the case, at least from opening opposition, we have some kind of attempt at a negative case and some kind of principle, although not very explained, that is at least something in terms of a contribution that's substantial, comparison to very, very little substantial contribution from closing government. Here are two ideas, by the way, of extensions that you could have run. Number one, this makes your life better. Just straight up stand up and say, many people have a utility problem, you know, the treadmill thing, where they live great lives and they can't really balance and base what their experiences are. This thing that they do once per year showcases how bad life can actually be. So then when they go outside, they feel good about their life. And so what if they're getting a divorce? And so what if their child doesn't like them? And so what if they're not getting a promotion? At least I'm not living abstract poverty. This is the first case. The second case, which is a bit more cool, but and more flashy, but requires a bit more analysis, is to just explain that not only is the government justified in doing this, the government should force us all to do this because of the lottery of birth. Because it's pure random throw of dice that all of us here right now are not experiencing this, that all of us here right now are not knowing all of these things. And in order to make society truly equitable, in order for people to truly equalize the playing field, and to equalize this is by throwing you in this pseudo prison for about a month and learning. And that you should know what the dark truth is. You should know what the true reality is, because it's total random arbitrary factors that protect you unlike these people. So these are just two extension ideas that I want to give you, because I know it's kind of harsh to hear that your extensions didn't land. So these are two ideas that you could have done. Cool. Bringing closing opposition to the debate. Closing opposition does broadly two things. Firstly, they explain that this is likely to cause immense harms to the larger part of society, and within this larger part, a certain subset of people are likely to face extreme mental harms, possible self-harm, and possible mental problems that continue with this. They then explain that given this is an action that doesn't have a clear societal impact or clear societal connection with most of our normal policies that we protect, like let's say taxes and redistribution, this seems more like a propaganda effort from the side of the government that goes to a current narrative-based option rather than an actual policy. Given that's the case, there isn't a very clear benefit that is derived from this, whereas it seems that they're offering uncertain harm. So this is the first way that closing opposition wins the debate. To be completely honest, opening government does have a pushback towards this, where opening government says, we don't care about the lives of the many, as long as we care about the lives of the really, really hurt ones, even though there are a small amount of people. However, in order for me to buy this comparison, I need to understand why the harms that you are talking about are not going to be that strong, so that I can go with this trade-off. I.e., if you yourself in opening government analyze this is likely to be extremely bad, this is likely to viscerally remind you of these types of experiences, then I don't necessarily understand, and if this applies to like 95% of the population, why on magnitude and on the scale of this harm, I should care about the 5% that are there. Of course, you do try to give an attempt at explaining this by providing reasons as to why the harms of these individuals are so severely bad. I do think that to a certain extent you're able to change it, but I don't think that you're able to change all 5% of people. But moreover, secondly, and this is the second thing the closing opposition gives to the debate, is that this is likely to cause societal inefficiencies, which leads to a general shrinking of the economy, or generally like people being, well, problematic to each other in terms of interactions, which harms your mechanism of change because it proves to you either A, that you have less capacity to enact the policies that you care about, and B, on the individual level, people, even if they mentally care about this stuff, won't physically be able to care about this stuff if they feel about distressed and if they feel problematic in these places. Meaning that if closing opposition can undercut the core premise of the mechanism of opening government and explain to us that the policy is illegitimate, directly weighing against opening government, closing opposition should win the debate. And that's under 10 minutes. Great. Thank you very much, guys, for this. If you want personal feedback, stay on the call. We can chat. Let me just turn off the recording off.